Well, hello there, students. My name is Mr. Little, and today we're going to take a look at the end of chapter 36. That is the end of World War II and the early Cold War. So that's 1945 to 1975. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the three following questions. How did the course of and end of World War II lead to new international organizations? How did the course of and end of World War II lead to new international rivalries? And how did the new technologies influence political rivalries into the post-war years? And you'll see what I mean by that. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up World War II here. So even though the war, being a total war, took up a lot of energy, time, and resources from all the nations involved, those involved were making distinct and very particular plans for the end of the war. There were three major interwar conferences at Cairo and Tehran in 1943, in which all agreed on the unconditional surrender of the Axis, basically meaning nobody was going to make a separate peace with the Axis. In addition, the Western Allies agreed to open up a second front at some point. At the Yalta Conference in 1944, which was right before the defeat of Germany, it was agreed upon that Germany would be divided to prevent it from ever waging war again. It would be disarmed, all of its military capabilities would be removed, and it would be denazified. So any influence of the Nazi Party would be permanently removed. At the Potsdam Conference, which was after the defeat of Germany, held just outside the German capital, the plans for the United Nations was finalized. Japan's surrender terms were outlined in the Potsdam Declaration, and in general, just sort of the end of the war, some of those final details were just sort of wrapped on up. So how did World War II actually end? Well, if you don't know, it's actually pretty straightforward. I mentioned in the last lecture that on the Eastern Front, the Soviets were pushing the Germans out of the Soviet Union, and by 1945, they had Berlin surrounded. Under those circumstances, Hitler thought it best to commit suicide, which he did, and about, I think it was 2 weeks later, Germany officially surrendered in May of 1945. And so there's the famous picture of the Soviet flag hanging over Berlin. I believe it's over the Reichstag, sort of that symbol of Soviet victory. In the East, things were pretty desperate for Japan, although the home islands themselves were never occupied. They were firebombed basically into oblivion. And the United States decided to finally unleash its atomic weapon that it had funded through the Manhattan Project. And this resulted in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And then about 2 weeks after that, the Soviets fulfilled their pledge at the Yalta Conference, which is that they would join the war in the Pacific by invading Manchukuo. That's the Japanese puppet state in northern China. And one day after that, the Americans dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Faced with these three blows in very rapid succession, the Japanese finally agreed to surrender in August of 1945. And so you can see here the mushroom cloud of the atomic bomb. Now, one thing I would like to note, something that sort of gets left out of the history books, is that a lot of the men who built the atomic bomb, who worked on the atomic bomb, a lot of them severely regretted it for the rest of their lives and tried to do everything they could to prevent its further diffusion and proliferation. They were so distraught by what they had created. A lot of them didn't even want it to be dropped on a city. A lot of them insisted that they should be tested like in the ocean or in a desert in order to make sure that it didn't harm people but could still demonstrate its vast power. That didn't fly with American high command, and they decided to drop the atomic bomb, but that led to the fundamental end of the war. So at the end of the war, as had been planned at the previous conferences, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, which each of the major powers getting one of the zones of occupation. That would be the Soviets, the British, the Americans, and the French. In addition to that, the city of Berlin, you can kind of see here in the middle of the Soviet zone, was also cut into 4 pieces. I believe this was for administrative purposes. Per keeping with the plan, Germany was demilitarized and deindustrialized. In particular, a lot of the industry, especially from the Soviet sector, was dismantled bolt by bolt, bit by bit, shipped back to the Soviet Union to make up for all the destroyed factories the Germans had ended up destroying during the war. On top of that, many German prisoners of war were forced to stay in the Soviet Union for sometimes up to 10 years after the end of the war to serve as forced labor to physically rebuild the damaged areas of the Soviet Union. This also happened in France, and this also happened in Denmark and a couple of other countries that had large numbers of German prisoners. Those prisoners did things like rebuild roads, rebuild houses, clear minefields, which was incredibly deadly. I think something like 2,000 soldiers a year for the first 3 years after the war died in the act of clearing minefields from like France and Denmark and the Netherlands. In addition to this repayment, if you will, Germans were also expelled from Eastern Europe. Around 12 million Germans, initially sort of on their own, but then later by force of the governments of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and a couple of other European nations, removed Germans from their territory and pushed them into the Western and Eastern occupation zones. This was very simple. The idea was that if German minorities in these countries had been Hitler's main justification for war, then we don't want them back and we're going to kick them out. So about 12 million Germans were forced to leave what is now Poland, what is now parts of Russia, and some other countries. Now, it's interesting that this was actually quite a few people. It was about 20% of the pre-war German population. And to this day, most Germans have at least some relative somewhere that was an expellee or someone who had to flee Eastern Europe. I have some family who had to flee from Eastern Europe, and my wife, who is German, also had some family that had to flee Eastern Europe. And so this is a big thing within Germany. The flight and the expulsion is very well known. But this was designed to make sure that war would never come again over the issue of national minorities. Although there is to this day still a tiny German minority in this particular part of Poland known as Silesia. In the east, Japan, while it was originally going to be partitioned and occupied like Germany, in the end the British didn't have the money, the Chinese just weren't interested, so the Americans agreed to occupy the home islands. However, they did agree to partition the Japanese colony of Korea in two, and so it was decided a couple of months before the end of the war to divide Korea at the 38th parallel. Now you may be wondering, why in the world did they pick the 38th parallel? Well, the answer was it was a very last minute decision. Two American intelligence officers were told that they had to come up with a way to divide Korea. They pulled a National Geographic map off the shelf. They looked at it and they said, the 38th parallel kind of looks like half, and it would allow America to have the historic capital of Seoul. So we'll just do it there. And that's it has been the dividing line in Korea ever since, and we'll talk about why in a future lecture. In addition to that, Japanese soldiers actually remained at their post in many parts of the Pacific for about 2 years afterwards, even in parts of China, just because it was taking so long for European soldiers and forces to make their way back into Asia after the destruction the Japanese had brought. So at the war's end, territory was divided and soldiers were very gradually returned home. But they were divided with the hopes that there would never again be a future war over these territories. And then we're going to see that didn't always work out the way they'd hoped. Per the discussions at the Yalta conference that Germany was to be denazified, this would also involve putting the leaders of Germany and later the leaders of Japan on trial. Now, what were they going to be charged with per se? Well, they were going to be charged with a series of 8 new laws that were being created specifically for this trial. Now, if this sounds like it was going to be a very contentious process, you better believe it was a very contentious process. Some people didn't even think they could charge German leaders with any kind of crime because they were technically the leaders of a nation, and whose laws are you going to charge them under? But representatives from the 4 major Allied powers, the British, the French, the Americans, and the Soviets, came together and, using a modified version of English common law, created the Nuremberg Protocols, of which they could charge Nazi leaders with 8 charges, which included, most infamously, crimes against humanity and conspiracy to wage war. Now, these trials were held at the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, which was a very important symbol because that's where Hitler had held some of his earliest rallies, and therefore it was necessary to have this be the dying place of Nazism, or so the Allies hoped. Now, there were 21 Nazi leaders put on trial. Some of them were military leaders. Some of them were heads of various organizations. And of those 21 put on trial, 18 were found guilty and 10 were executed for their crimes. One committed suicide before he could be executed, though. Now, in the Far East, in Tokyo, the Nuremberg Protocols were used there as well. 22 Japanese leaders were put on trial for all of those charges, and 19 of them were found guilty, and 7 of them were executed. That said, in general, very few people faced any kind of repercussion. In addition to the Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials, individual countries and individual tribunals may have put individual soldiers on trial for crimes those individual soldiers committed. And I believe something like 800 Japanese and 500 German soldiers were convicted and sentenced to death. But apart from those, in addition to the Japanese and German prisoners of war who were used in labor and might have died in those conditions, let's estimate that maybe that comes out to maybe 5,000 to 6,000 total, maybe unless there's something I'm forgetting here. You know, that's 5,000 to 6,000 total out of armies of millions of men, right? It's fairly safe to say that your average German soldier who might have committed an atrocity did not face any kind of repercussion or any kind of consequences. After 1948, the Allies pretty much gave up on denazification. It just wasn't a good idea with the ongoing Cold War, which we're going to get to in one second. But that said, the newly created state of Israel did not give up. In fact, they notoriously hunted down former Nazis that had managed to escape to South America after the war, including their most famous capture of Adolf Eichmann, who had been one of the architects behind the Wannsee Conference, who they captured in Argentina, shipped back to Israel, put on trial, and executed. And so, you know, again, very few people faced repercussions, but there are some pretty good examples of people trying to make sure that other people face repercussions. So one of the criticisms of the Nuremberg trials was that it, in fact, was a victor's justice, right? The Allies had committed pretty much all the same crimes they were accusing the Germans of having committed: expelling people, terror bombing cities. The Soviet Union had technically invaded Poland with Germany and the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So some people call this a victor's justice, and I think it's not. It's a fair description to say there was a bit of victor's justice, and the fact that the Allies would go on to pretty much commit all those crimes during the Cold War. But all the same, the Nuremberg Protocols did lay the groundwork for the International Law Commission, which was put together in the 1950s to draw up the first set of international laws regarding the conduct in conflict and the conduct of leaders. This would eventually result in the creation of the International Criminal Court in 1998, which has tried a number of high-profile leaders accused of committing war crimes. Of course, it also has its criticisms, and the fact that not every nation is a part of it, and the fact that they cannot force somebody to come to that court, questionable usefulness. But still, it set a precedent that I think is a positive one. And so that is one of the legacies of World War II. So one of the other major legacies of the Second World War was the creation of an organization known as the United Nations, or the UN, which you've definitely probably heard of, I hope. Formally created in 1945, although it had been talked about during the war, the San Francisco Conference officially created it, which is why if you visit the city of San Francisco, there is United Nations Square in the middle of the city. Now, the United Nations was essentially the successor to the League of Nations, which had become defunct after 1939. And one of the biggest changes to the United Nations was the creation of a Security Council, whose job it was to determine when there was a threat to international peace and to dispatch a peacekeeping force. Now, this was an attempt to solve the problems of like collective security. And whereas before no nation had wanted to be the one that had to send their soldiers to do the peacekeeping, now all member nations submitted members to these peacekeeping forces in an attempt to sort of, spread out the obligation among the nations. And peacekeepers have been dispatched to places like Cyprus, the Sinai Peninsula, Korea, East Timor, in an attempt to limit or even stop conflict altogether. But that said, they're not a military force that comes in and necessarily defeats one side of the conflict. If anything, they've pretty much always been sort of a buffer, if you will, to sort of there in between the two combatants so that the two combatants can't shoot at each other. And this has had a lot of questionable success. There have been a couple of really good cases and then a couple of really not so successful cases. But since the 1970s, with the inability to sort of really solve a lot of the peacekeeping missions they've been sent to, there's really been a de-emphasis at the UN on peacekeeping. There have been a couple of famous peacekeeping missions since then, but it's really been de-emphasized since the 1970s. Instead, the UN is focused more on humanitarian issues, cultural developments, and economic development. And one of the earliest things the UN did was the creation of the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, drafted in part by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And this was a big shift in human history. The Declaration said that no matter your religion, no matter your race, no matter who you were, man or woman, you had rights. And these rights had to be protected. And if these rights were violated, you could theoretically at least bring the violator to court or some sort of punishment, right? Which again, enforceable, questionable, but again, it set a precedent for what would hopefully be a more positive trend in the future. There are other programs to prevent famine and hunger through the World Food Program and UNICEF, which is for children. The UN has really tried to pick up the slack where the League of Nations did not do particularly well. Its record is mixed, but it still is a powerful institution all the same. So the Cold War, which we're going to talk about in one second, but to understand why the Cold War sort of complicated things at the UN, was that the Cold War was an ideological rivalry between America, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Both of them had permanent seats on the Security Council, which meant they could veto any claim to international security threats. They could veto any attempt to send a peacekeeping force. And they both used this veto to protect their allies. So if the United States claimed a Soviet ally was committing human rights abuses or being aggressive, the Soviet Union would just veto that attempt to declare them an aggressor in the Security Council, which kind of really crippled the ability of the UN to effectively function in the years after World War II. In addition to that, a lot of the conflicts that the UN was sort of forced to peacekeep were decolonization-related conflicts, such as those in British Palestine or the former Yugoslavia. And again, a mixed result on these, and so hence another reason kind of why the UN has moved a little bit away from the peacekeeping mission and tried to do a little bit more with the humanitarian aid development. The UN is one of the big legacies of World War II. So here we can see sort of an org chart of the United Nations. The thing about the UN is that the preceding League of Nations only had, for example, these three, a Secretariat, a Security Council, and a General Assembly, but it did not have any of these exterior organs, a Court of Justice. It didn't promote any social welfare, although it did have commissions that looked into social welfare related issues. All in all, the UN is much more comprehensive than the League ever was in terms of what it is attempting to do. That doesn't mean it's necessarily any more successful, but it is at least a more valiant effort, and in some very particular respects, it's done a little bit better than the League. All right, let's really quick talk about what the Cold War was. Now, the Cold War is called as such because it wasn't a shooting war. No, it wasn't cold. It's called cold because it wasn't hot. Hot war would be pew pew. Cold War is no pew pew. Cold War is just a lot of mean talk and smack talk. The formal definition of the Cold War is a period of geopolitical tension and ideological rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies following World War II that is usually dated between somewhere of 1947 to 1991. Down here, you can kind of see a map of the major areas, who was allied with who. The darker or lighter blue were usually allied to some extent with the United States, and the red, different shades, was to some extent allied with the Soviet Union to various degrees. And then the yellow, you may have noticed, is China, because China also started to play a role in the Cold War. We'll talk a little bit about that. But yeah, it's an ideological conflict. Now, to be absolutely clear, that means that they're vying for the hearts and minds, if you will, right? The ideology of communism or the ideology of democracy, much in the way that the ideology of fascism was one of the causes of the hot war that was World War II. The Cold War is also an ideological rivalry. Now, we've seen ideological rivalries before in history. This is not a new thing. Again, World War II, but even before then, places where two ideologies, usually religions, collided, there may be conflict, but there'll also usually be a lot of give and take, a lot of exchange. But the difference now is that these ideologies are so wide-reaching, right? There's nowhere in the world here that isn't touched in some respect by this ideological conflict. And that's one of the biggest changes about the Cold War from other ideological conflicts, right? Is its global, total reach. So how do we understand this ideological conflict, right? How do we interpret it, right? How do we balance the roles of the superpowers versus the decolonizing states that they were seeking to influence, right? Duration, when did it even start, and who's to blame for it? Is anybody to blame for it? Is there mutual blame for it? I don't know. The traditional account in the United States and sort of the Western academic world comes from John Gaddis, and it's a book called The United States and the Origins of the Cold War. And basically what he says is the Cold War is America's response to aggressive Soviet expansion in the years after World War II, in which the Soviet Union sought to dominate Eurasia in the aftermath of the Second World War. That has traditionally been the interpretation in most mainstream American history courses. And there's some truth to that, but it's a very, very one-sided interpretation, as you can kind of see. So it's good to supplement it with other interpretations. So, for example, The New Cold War by Odd Westend argues that the Cold War is, in fact, just part of the long 20th century. And he argues that it's this competition actually grows out of the special history of both the United States and Russia, both of which saw themselves as having a special destiny on the world stage, even before the Russian Revolution. And he argued that the Cold War is just a continuation of that, right? In addition, he points out that the rivalry began long before World War II. He points to the fact that the United States intervened in the Russian Civil War. Here you can see American soldiers marching through Vladivostok. During the Russian Civil War, the Americans attempted to weaken the communist state before it could be born, along with a number of other Western allies. And so to Dr. Westend, it's a continuation of pre-existing historical processes. In addition to that, while this Cold War is usually viewed as a time of peace, if not a time of tension, other historians taking a more global view of it say, no, actually, it was a very violent time, in part because decolonization is intimately linked with the Cold War, and the fact that so many decolonizing states sought power or aid or assistance from the Cold War powers was a source of violence and a source of bloodshed. And in his book, The Cold War's Killing Fields by Paul Chamberlain, he points out that this competition for influence in the decolonizing world promoted a massive wave of violence that killed around 14 million people when it was all said and done. In addition to that, he points out that after the 1970s, it wasn't even a capitalist versus communist thing anymore. It started to break down into just general sectarian violence that was backed by either side, depending on who they thought they could control better. And one of his main examples of this is the fact that communist Vietnam went to war with communist Cambodia after the Vietnam War, and then went to war with communist China after that. So clearly, he's arguing that, the whole East-West communist versus capitalist dichotomy doesn't really work that well, or that's just sort of a simplified view of things. And so some combination of all these really helps to sort of understand the complexities of the Cold War. So when does the Cold War begin? How does it begin? Well, the thing is, even though it's the ideological rivalry between the United States and their European allies and the Soviet Union, you could see that happening even before the end of World War II, right? Churchill and the British Empire had gone to war with Nazi Germany to protect the future of Poland. It was becoming very clear by war's end that the Soviet Union was going to liberate Poland from Nazi rule, but it was not clear that they were going to let them have free and fair elections, which Churchill was trying to be very adamant about, because that's the whole reason for starting the war in the first place. If Poland can't be saved, then what the heck was the point of it all? On the other hand, Stalin was very irritated at the Western allies because for years he had begged them, please open a second front against the Nazis. We're fighting like 80% of the German army here. We're losing millions of people every year. To which the Allies said, we'll do it eventually. And then they opened up a second front in Africa. and then in Italy, not exactly the heaviest places of Nazi concentration. So Stalin was also very irritated and firmly believed that the Western allies were just trying to shore up their own interests before the end of the war. So this ideological rivalry was happening even before the end of the war. And here's that meme, is a meme that I think really embodies Stalin and Churchill's sort of exchange, right? I will liberate Poland from the Nazis and let them have free elections. And let them have free elections, right? I think it might have got cut off there at the bottom, but you get the idea. So after the war, when the shooting finally stopped, each side was seeking to build influence in their respective occupied zones: the United States, Western Europe, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. And believe it or not, the Soviet Union was actually incredibly popular, even though every state in Eastern Europe had gone to war with the USSR, except for Yugoslavia. The fact that the Nazis had been defeated by the USSR, the Soviet Union had paid so high a price to defeat the evils of Nazism and liberate Eastern Europe, made them very popular, to the point where people sort of forgot that Stalin had been one of the people that invaded Poland and started the war and signed the secret treaty with Hitler. All was pretty much forgiven. And communists were very popular. As far away as France, communists were getting elected in the local governments just because communism was at such a high point right now. And a lot of Europeans were very nervous about all these Americans showing up with their high consumerist values, that communism had a bit of popularity. And of course, the United States was getting a little bit nervous about this, to the point where they tried to stop communists from having any kind of say in governments. First, by interfering in elections. As you can see here, this is a piece of propaganda from an Italian election in the 40s, basically stating that you need to not vote for the communists, even though they were doing very well in the polls. The CIA gave them tons of money to pay for things like this, as well as convinced Italian Americans at home to write letters to Italians stating that the communists are like really bad, don't vote for them. So the newly created CIA was already interfering with elections long before any accusation of election interference from the Soviet Union. That is not to say that the Soviet Union didn't meddle in politics and maybe tip the scales a little bit, especially places where the Red Army was stationed. So in 1948, in Czechoslovakia, the communists, which had won a good number of seats in the Czechoslovakian parliament, staged a full-out coup and seized power. Now, the fact that there were, a couple 100,000 Red Army soldiers stationed in Czechoslovakia didn't hurt those chances. But it's things like this that sort of made the USA a little bit nervous. That's to say, both sides were willing to take extreme measures to support their spheres of influence. In particular, though, what most historians agree sort of kicked off the Cold War was Soviet activity in Turkey and Greece and Iran. Now, it's funny, you don't think about the Cold War as a Middle East thing, but the Cold War, I think, arguably actually began in Iran, in particular because the Soviet Union was attempting to set up the Autonomous Republic of Azerbaijan out of northern Iranian territory. And this made Iran very nervous and made the US very nervous. Now, the Soviets thought this was only fair. Again, we sacrificed millions of people to defeat Nazism. We should be allowed to have a little bit of territory. Same thing in Turkey. Turkey controlled the Bosphorus Strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. The Soviet Union wanted to renegotiate the almost 80-year-old treaty that dictated how the straits would be used, and it thought it had earned the right to do that. So it started to put a little bit of pressure on Turkey to maybe renegotiate the treaty. In addition to that, the Soviet Union supported the Greek Communist Party, which had taken to the hills in an armed resistance against what it saw as a British-imposed attempt to restore the monarchy, which had fallen after the Nazi invasion during the war. And so all of these things, which the Soviet Union thought it had rightfully earned, were making the United States very nervous. Now, George Kennan, who was a State Department official in Moscow, was asked to give an analysis of a speech that Stalin gave in 1947. And instead, he sent back what's known as the long telegram, the longest telegram in State Department history, in which he basically said the Soviet Union is going to expand no matter what. We basically have to be willing to contain them and stop them at every turn, right? We have to use every means at our disposal. Military, we have to prevent them from subtly influencing politics, and also stop them from subtly influencing culture, because they will do it. And basically, his telegram would later shape the policy of US President Harry Truman, which is known as containment, which was pretty much US policy until the end of the Cold War, basically stating that we are going to stop and we're going to roll back communism wherever we find it, to the extent that we're capable of. Now, this, in practice, committed America to making some very unsavory friendships and putting their soldiers in places that only not even 50 years earlier, most Americans would never have dreamed of sending American soldiers. So this is a very big break in American policy, just domestically. Now, it's worth noting that there is a telegram from a Soviet official that's kind of considered the alternate to the long telegram. It's called Novikov's telegram from a year before, in which he outlined sort of the Soviet position, which is that the United States had grown immensely powerful during the war. It had built thousands of bases all around the world, but now that the war was over, it didn't seem to want to dismantle those bases. It wasn't reducing its armaments. In fact, if anything, it was building more. And now that it had the atomic bomb, it was building more atomic bombs. Now the United States is going to pose as a threat to the Soviet Union. And so both sides definitely view the other as an existential threat. And I think these two telegrams kind of put side by side definitely illustrate that point. Now, this is that you're looking, this what you're looking at right here is a contemporary cartoon, as in it was made now around the 2000s, but it's essentially designed to show the distinction between the points of view and how each side thought the other one was trying to encircle them or aggress them through their allies. Here you can see the names of countries that might be encircling or expanding the influence of one or the other powers, right? So this is kind of an example of the Cold War points of view that dominated in the early days of the Cold War. The thing about the Cold War is that it made everything an ideological competition. Even rebuilding Europe became a massive ideological competition. And so initially, the plan had sort of been to let European powers rebuild themselves and to keep Germany denazified and demilitarized. But the Cold War kind of made that untenable. So the United States took the lead in deciding to rebuild its Western allies. And so George Marshall, who'd been a general during the war, organized what has become known as the European Recovery Plan, or more simply, the Marshall Plan in 1948, which gave 13 billion US dollars at the time to help rebuild the European economies. In addition, another 6 billion was given to Asia, but not in any kind of plan, just sort of piecemeal as it was needed. What did this include? It included things like technical aid, food relief, and my favorite, mules from Missouri. The mules from Missouri were given to Greece to replace the local mule stock that had been killed during the war, where they just took to the hills and have been a favorite part of Greece ever since. Now, the Soviet Union rejected the Marshall Plan, and historians believe that part of the reason they supported the coup in Czechoslovakia was because Czechoslovakia had actually asked for some Marshall aid money. Now, one of the main reasons the Soviet Union rejected the Marshall Plan was very simple: the fact that a ton of Marshall Plan aid was being given to the western part of Germany, the Allied occupied sectors. Remember, this is 3 years after the end of the war, 3 years after the defeat of Nazi Germany, and now America is literally giving millions, if not billions of dollars to the former Nazis and kind of giving up on that whole denazification thing. This is just to the Soviet, you have to understand how this appeared to the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union rejected this and formed their own Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, known as COMECON. And you can see a little sticker up here with all the flags of the nations of COMECON, which lasted until the end of the Soviet Union, but it basically promoted exchange between the nations of the communist world. And so this sort of bound them closer together in a tighter economic alliance than they had been before. But it also tightened Soviet sort of influence and control over them. Now, all this sort of came to a head in what is known as the Berlin blockade, which lasted for about a year. Now, the city of Berlin was deep in the Soviet sector, as you might remember, but the treaty that had ended the war gave the Allies unlimited access to it, so they could take a train anytime they wanted through the Soviet sector of Germany to get to Berlin, to get to their parts of Berlin, the French, the British, or the American part. However, the Soviet Union, in response to the fact that the Allies were letting their part of Germany, the 3 sectors in the West, use a single currency, which the Soviet Union saw correctly as being a prelude to a reunification of the Western sectors. They decided to sort of try to force the Allies to give up, and they blockaded Berlin. They cut off rail, water, land, and electricity to the city. The only thing they didn't cut off were airplanes, which they didn't think would be able to supply the city with enough supplies. But as it turns out, it did. It was able to, and the Americans and the British and the French were determined to make sure that Berlin did not fall. And this is a massive logistics undertaking, and I have a separate presentation which I talk all about the amazing logistics of the Berlin airlift, or the Berlin Luftbrücke. But it was one of the first great post World War II uses of the American Air Force. It also solidified America's alliance with Germany, brought a lot of Germans kind of over to the Western alliance. You know, a lot of that World War II bitterness kind of finally faded, at least some of it. In particular, one pilot who was known for dropping chocolate bars out of his airplane down to the kids when he would be like making his regular flights into the city of Berlin. He would tie little chocolate bars around little parachutes and just like throw them out the window of his plane so kids could get them. He actually died, I think, only like 2 weeks ago, but he was widely remembered in Berlin. In fact, my wife's grandfather's brother got a couple of those chocolate bars. It just became a very big thing for the people of Berlin, and kind of repaired a lot of the diplomatic stress that had come about as a result of World War II. In the end, the Soviet Union relented, let the Allies have access to East Berlin again, But the result was that Germany was now going to be divided. The Western Allies allowed their 3 sectors to reunite into West Germany in 1948, and in 1949, the Soviet Union allowed its eastern sector to become East Germany. And so by 1950, we have 2 Germanys, and these 2 Germanys are going to become a symbol of a divided Europe. They're going to become a symbol of what's called the Iron Curtain. That is a line of communist influenced states that run down the middle of Europe. And eventually the Berlin Wall is going to be built, and that's going to be around the city of West Berlin, although the East Germans called it the anti-fascist protection barrier. But it really became a symbol. Germany became a symbol of the division of Europe into these two camps. So real quick, here's a picture of the Berlin Wall, kind of running through the city of Berlin. The wall was about, I believe, 8 feet tall, made of concrete, and then you had to run through a field of barbed wire and open ground where there were potentially guard posts that could shoot you if they caught you doing that. It was a very dangerous thing, but it basically kept the citizens of West Berlin trapped within the city, except they could fly out. On the right here, you see sort of a map of the Eastern Bloc, behind which the Iron Curtain had descended, although you'll notice that not all of the countries who are communist are aligned with the Soviet Union, most notably Yugoslavia and Albania eventually sort of broke with the USSR. We'll talk a little bit about why that is at a future point. So part of the division of Europe into rival camps meant the division of Europe into military alliances in which almost every European state was involved, save for a few that remained neutral. This is, again, not new. Europe has been divided into alliances before. Remember the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente? And right before World War II, you had the Anti-Comintern Pact, which wasn't really an alliance, but it was kind of like one. So the first alliance was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was created in 1948 as Germany began to be reintegrated into West European society. NATO is a three-part alliance. It had three purposes. As one early commander of NATO said, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, as in keep America involved in Europe, keep the Germans down, as in prevent Germany from rising up and ever becoming a menace again, and to keep the Russians out of Europe. It was essentially an anti-Soviet alliance at its core. Although I can't really stress enough how much the keeping Germany part of Western Europe aspect was really important. The only way they were going to let Germany have guns again was to have it be part of NATO, so that never again Germany would try to pursue some weird special third way that could bring it closer to the Soviet Union. And this was part of the containment policy, right? Containing Soviet communism, making sure it didn't go into Greece and Turkey, meant they were two of the earliest members. It also meant that the United States was going to try to make a bunch of other treaties, ANZUS, which is with Australia and New Zealand, SEATO, which is in Southeast Asia, and CENTO, which was in the Middle East. All of these other alliances were sort of questionable value, but it was a major shift in U.S. policy. Remember, America had been dedicated to not getting involved in foreign entanglements prior to World War II. So this was a huge shift as part of the Cold War, right? This ideological rivalry drove the U.S. to make alliances everywhere, right, in an attempt to get people on their side of the ideological rivalry. The Eastern Bloc countries responded with the creation of the Warsaw Pact. Now, this was a military alliance dominated by the Soviet Union. Officially, it was in defense against NATO. And to be fair, the Warsaw Pact never was deployed outside of Eastern Europe, although it did send advisors to various countries around the world. And it was only deployed within its own borders. But all the same, these alliances kept the Europe on edge for quite a while. This was a very tense time. And although it never actually sparked war, it definitely made it one of the hottest zones in the world. If the Cold War ever got hot, Europe was going to have a really bad time, as they say. As with any ideological competition, you're going to have a scientific and technical competition as well. Now, the biggest one was the creation of nuclear weapons. Now, the United States had spent tons of money on the Manhattan Project. Despite all that money spent, the Soviet Union had an excellent spy network, which included some of the people working on the bomb itself. And so by 1948, the Soviet Union also had an atomic bomb, a copy of the one the Americans had dropped on Japan. But basically, this kicked off the nuclear arms race. And as you can see here, both sides would eventually spend huge, vast quantities of money to build warheads, to the point where the Soviet Union at one point had 40,000, and the US at its peak had around 33,000. These are tons of nukes. And they started off as simple atomic bombs, and then they eventually elevated up into hydrogen bombs, which are like small atomic bombs to make a bigger bomb. And then you eventually get neutron bombs, which are designed to kill people but not really damage a lot of buildings. And so essentially this nuclear arms race, right? And the danger, the fear here was that the nuclear arms race was going to result in mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And this fear almost was realized in 1962 with what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the United States saw that the Soviet Union was putting missiles on communist Cuba and almost went to war with the USSR. In the end, they negotiated a peace by which the USSR would take its missiles out of Cuba, the US would take some missiles out of Turkey, and everybody would kind of get along. But it did almost lead to war. It was a tense couple of days, along with another incident known as Able Archer 83, which also almost led to nuclear war. A lot of close calls. Now, the United States tested these bombs mostly in the Southwest, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, along with out in the Pacific Ocean, obliterating atolls that took like millions of years to form. In particular, the United States often would test these bombs and mine the uranium inside them near or on Native American reservations, which is part of the reason why to this day in the United States, Native Americans have some of the highest rates of cancer of any group at all because of their close exposure to the test. Now, the Soviet Union did something similar, irradiating certain parts of Kazakhstan in order to test their bombs. And all of this eventually put pressure, led to an anti-nuclear movement that would put some pressure on the great powers to create a nuclear test ban treaty, which would ban above ground testing. You could still do below ground testing, but you couldn't do above ground testing anymore in 1963. And we haven't detonated a nuke above ground, except for an unexplained explosion in the 1970s off the coast of Africa, which some people think may have been South Africa's nuclear program. But in addition to that, there was another technical competition. That's a space race, right? Now, today we think about, going to space, and it's in the hands of a private company ran by a guy named Elon Musk. But back in the day, the United States government took the role in the U.S. space program. The Soviets had taken the lead in the space race by launching the first man-made satellite that could orbit the planet, known as Sputnik. And this terrified the United States, right? Sometimes called the Sputnik moment, where the idea is we're not funding science, research, education. Our boys and girls are just too stupid. They can't compete with the intelligent Soviet men and women. And therefore, we must fund more research, more development, more education, right? And eventually this results in the Apollo 11 mission, in which the United States is the first country to put a man on the moon. And therefore we won the space race. Or did we? I'm going to show you something in a second. But one of the sort of side effects of the space race, along with the wider Cold War in the US, was the creation of what's known as the military industrial complex. Now, this is a combination of private companies, private contractors, politicians, as well as research companies that together had a vested interest in making sure the US still built plenty of weapons, exported plenty of weapons to support their Cold War allies. And this military industrial complex does continue to exist today. It's been the subject of a lot of criticism within the United States, but remains a prominent factor. And it touched a lot of American lives. My grandfather was part of this. He built fighter jets for a particular company, right? So a lot of Americans were very involved in all of this. One other thing that came out of the fear of Sputnik was funding for something called the ARPANET, which was a connection of computers across different locations. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's because it's the forerunner to the modern internet. I also talk a little bit about this in a separate lecture that I'll link in the description about the rise of the ARPANET and the growth of the internet. But all the same, the Cold War competition created a lot of new technologies, some of which we use today, a lot of space age technologies in our everyday lives, such as GPS and even ballpoint pens. In addition, the Olympics, which had become a thing after the 1890s, only interrupted by the World Wars, also became a realm of competition, right? Wanting to show which side had the superior athletes, much in the way Nazi Germany had in the years before World War II. In addition, though, the Olympics also could be a weapon to try to shame the other side. So, for example, in 1980, the Moscow Olympics were boycotted by the US and many of her allies because the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. And in 1984, in response to that, the Soviet Union and her allies boycotted the 1984 LA Olympics. So, Olympic boycotts were a big thing. The famous Miracle on Ice, the Winter Olympics of 1980, where the US beat the Soviet ice hockey team, has also gone down as an example of like American determination. Sports competitions aren't just for the Rocky movies. They're also a big part of actual Cold War diplomacy. So here's a meme that kind of gets at this whole thing about, who won the space race? Who did better, right? As you can see, the Soviet Union took the lead on a lot of metrics, first artificial satellite, first person in space, first spacewalk, sending the first spacecraft to another planet beside the moon. But technically, America did put the first man on the moon. So America wins the space race. I personally like this. I like this meme because it does illustrate how sort of American-centric we usually talk about things like the space race and ignore contributions from other parts of the world. All right, let's cover some of those early events from the early Cold War. So worth noting that the Cold War cannot be separated from the decolonization and local movements that took place around the world. So as the USA and the USSR vied for influence in their ideological competition, they often tried to get the leaders, the newly decolonized states in Asia and Africa, as well as the ongoing leaders of South and Central America, Latin America, to work with them. How did they do this? Well, they might give them weapons, they might give them aid, they might give them advisors, and they might just outright threaten them in the case of the United States and Latin America, the Soviet Union, and some parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In particular, agricultural technology like tractors was very helpful. The Soviet Union was known to fund a large number of infrastructure projects around the world. The USA also did some of that as well. But in particular, probably no weapon was as widely distributed throughout the Cold War as the Automatic Kalashnikov 47 or the AK-47. And all of its variants were given out in huge numbers to anybody who did not like the United States or could convince the Soviet Union to give them some. And all of this all this weaponry, unfortunately, intensified conflict. Remember that phrase from World War II, intensified conflict, right? A lot of small issues, border issues, different cultural groups that may not have gotten along, but were then pushed together because of imperialism, now were put into a single nation. That not only that was now being ruled by an autocrat, probably a dictator of some sort, that was being given weapons and arms by one side or the other. That's the kind of the negative effect the Cold War had on the effective nation building. And the result was a lot of proxy wars, although often not so much between countries as within single countries, right? Proxy wars are when two sides stand in for the Soviet Union and the United States, or sometimes China. They are the hot wars of the Cold War, and there are countless of them. We're going to talk about a few of them when we get to the various parts of the Cold War, but two of the more well-known ones are the Vietnam War and the Korean War, as well as the crisis in the Congo, which was an ongoing period of internal unrest, fueled in part by both sides in the Central African nation of the Congo, right? So, for example, here we can see the Korean War, in which North Korea invaded South Korea, and then the United States, with the United Nations support, pushed the North Koreans back, but then the Chinese got involved and pushed the South Koreans and the United Nations forces all the way back down to the original border, which is pretty much where it's at today. So that's what we call a proxy war, where each side stands in for the other side. At least officially, American soldiers and Soviet soldiers never shot at each other, but they had their proxies do it instead. In addition to that, the United States and the Soviet Union were more than happy to influence the politics of local places wherever they could. So, for example, this included in 1953 overthrowing the government of Iran when the United States was concerned about its nationalization of the oil industry, as well as the coup against the nation of Guatemala in 1954, as well as the Soviet crushing of the Hungarian attempt to move a little bit further away from the Soviet Union in 1956. Both sides were perfectly willing to use violence to achieve their means. And that's part of the Cold War. It's not just trying to get people on your side, but it's also being willing to use force, play dirty, and use money to get various leaders of various countries on your side. Of course, it should also be noted that a lot of this was in secret. The coup in Iran was put together by the CIA, as well as a spy named Kermit Roosevelt, who was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. So a lot of these coups against governments that maybe weren't favorable to the US or weren't favorable to the Soviet Union were often done in secret, very much in secret, not out in the open. So it's kind of that culture of espionage. You can also see here, this is a part of a Diego Rivera mural that I'm just a really big Diego Rivera fan. And this is called The Glorious Victory, and it shows the United States Secretary of State John Foster Dulles shaking hands with the new military dictatorship of Guatemala after they have overthrown President Arbenz in 1954. In addition, here you see a bomb with President Eisenhower's face on it, and that's because the United States Air Force bombed Guatemala during the course of the coup. You can see on the right, you have the military dictatorship, in part backed up by the Catholic Church. And on the left, you can see bananas, which are, again, the reason why the United States got involved in the first place, is because the Arbenz government wanted to nationalize some of United Fruit's holdings in Guatemala. And so Diego Rivera, in his usual mural manner, has tried to compress all the events of the coup into a single painting that sort of gets at the big idea of the Cold War. All right, so let's sort of wrap things up with this presentation by sort of talking about some of the events of the later Cold War. So one of the things that characterized about 10 years into the Cold War, something known as the Sino-Soviet split. Now, China had gone communist in 1949 when the communist Chinese had defeated the nationalist Chinese, and the nationalist Chinese had fled to the island of Taiwan. And after that, the Soviet Union and China became BFFs linked at the hip, as can be seen by tons of Sino-Soviet propaganda. However, with the death of Joseph Stalin in 1956 and the Soviet Union kind of going in a slightly different direction than Stalin had wanted to take the Soviet Union, which included not giving as much aid to China as Stalin had been giving to China. And in addition, probably what hurt, for example, Mao Zedong the most was the fact that not only was the Soviet Union kind of going in a slightly different direction, but they were actively discrediting Stalin in a process known as De-Stalinization. His sort of image and legacy was removed from a lot of public spaces in the Soviet Union. This was an attempt by these new Soviet leaders to draw a line under Stalin and be like, look, we're different now. No more terror, no more purges, no more murder. We're still going to have gulags, but it's not going to be as bad. That said, Mao Zedong did not like this. And so after the death of Stalin, there began to be a lot of bickering, some name calling, and then eventually there were some border clashes out in Siberia. But it meant that now there was a third player in the Cold War, which was China, who was going to try to assert its own influence in some places where maybe the Soviet Union wasn't really interested, or the USA wasn't interested, places like Bangladesh, Somalia, Albania, third player, essentially, in the Cold War. It also meant that Maoism, that is the way that Mao Zedong and the communists had managed to beat the Japanese and the nationalists, which I'll talk about a little bit more at some point in the future, was going to become a distinct ideology ideology in the Cold War. Whereas before, Marxist-Leninism, that is Stalinism, had been basically the communist ideology. China had developed its own communist ideology and would now sort of preach that to the rest of the world. In addition, there was something called the Third World Movement, which picked up steam and sort of reached its apogee in the 1970s. Now, I have a whole separate lecture on the Third World Movement, also known as the Non-Aligned Movement. But the short version is it was a group of newly decolonized nations who came together at the Bandung Conference in 1955 to openly state that they would not be aligned with either power. Now, some of them were monarchies, some of them were democracies, some of them were kind of communist countries, but this group of nations said that we're not going to be aligned with either power. We're going to advocate for democratizing the UN. We're going to advocate disarmament. We're going to advocate world peace, and we're not going to align with either power bloc because we're not going to be part of this insane world. And that was the Third World Movement, a big, small but notable player in the Cold War. And finally, there was the policy of détente, which lasted from the early 70s to the mid 70s. And basically, it was a time period where, for a minute, it looked like both sides, the Soviet Union and the United States, might just sort of learn to live with each other, might just kind of get along. Détente is a French word. It means sort of a cooling off period, right? Part of the reason the US sought to cool off was very simple. It was spending a ton of money in the Vietnam War. It was just not literally, but figuratively bankrupting America. And so America was looking for desperately any way to sort of cool down tensions with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was also looking for a relief from the high cost of the arms race, as well as the fact that China was no longer its friend. It wanted to pursue slightly closer relations with the US. So, for example, in 1973, both sides signed the SALT I treaty, which limited the number of nukes each could build. There's also the famous handshake in space, in which Soviet cosmonauts and US astronauts met on the space station and met in space and shook hands for the camera, sort of symbolizing this unification of these two ideas in space. And finally, there was the very famous Helsinki Accords, which maybe could be considered the peak of détente, in which both sides agreed to respect human rights. Now, people in the United States criticized then President Ford for this, claiming that he had effectively ceded ground to the Soviet Union on this whole thing. And to an extent, the Soviet Union did get a little bit of pressure off of it in terms of its human rights abuses. But it also meant that human rights activists within the Soviet Union could now say, hey, those gulags that you have, that's against the Helsinki Accords. You're not supposed to do that. And so it's just sort of an acknowledgement of maybe both sides could get along. Maybe the USA and the USSR could be the two world superpowers. They could make sure that little conflicts don't get bigger. Instead of intensifying violence by giving guns and ammunition to both sides, maybe they could work to de-escalate violence, right? Maybe they could make sure that no other nations built nukes, because by that time, 6 nations had nukes. Maybe they could prevent further endangerment of the world, right? And that was a dream for a minute, but the problem was that domestically, this was very unpopular within the United States, especially after the loss of Vietnam. A lot of Americans felt like they had to take a hard line against the Soviet Union. And in addition to that, the Soviet Union made the decision to invade Afghanistan in 1979 to prop up a faltering communist regime there, and that pretty much kicked everything back off again. And then we're about to enter the most expensive and perhaps the most dangerous part of the Cold War under the era of Reagan. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in some future presentation. But anyways, I want to thank you so much for joining me, and I sincerely hope you've learned something and you should be able to answer those 3 questions from the beginning of the presentation. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.